I am in the expensive neighborhood of Forest Hill. It is north of the downtown, and it is right on the intersection of Bathurst and Eglinton Avenue West. And I am walking towards what would have been the lot where Honey Sherman planned on building her dream home. And it is located at 91 Old Forest Hill Road. And this lot, which is 20,000 square feet at the time that she purchased it with her husband, Barry Sherman, both billionaires, well-known philanthropists in Toronto. And Barry Sherman created the pharmaceutical company Apothec, which he was very proud of. And back in 2017, both Barry and Honey Sherman were murdered in Toronto at 50 Old Colony Road. And their bodies weren't discovered for 2 days. The Toronto Police Service initially thought it was a murder-suicide. But after the Sherman family conducted a second autopsy, the Toronto Police Service, 6 weeks after their deaths, determined that in fact it was a double homicide. And this neighborhood here is where Honey Sherman was going to build her dream home. And the property itself at the time in 2016, when she purchased this 20,000 square foot lot, was worth $10 million. And a lot of the conflict within the family at the time came about because the cost of Honey Sherman's dream home ballooned to $30 million. And although they were billionaires, Barry and Honey Sherman were very careful with how they spent their money. And just to give you an example, prior to their murders, they had planned a holiday in Fort Lauderdale. And Barry Sherman was to meet up with Honey in Fort Lauderdale. And he bought his return ticket with the aeroplan points he had saved up. And these houses here are quite impeccable. The average cost of a home in this neighborhood is $4.5 million. And I am walking towards the lot where their dream home was meant to be built. And one of the guidelines in this Forest Hill neighborhood is that when someone buys a lot here, they have to build their house in such a way that it is cohesive with the other houses or mansions in this part of Toronto. And today I'm going to be focusing on the estate of Barry Sherman and the will. And more specifically, who was the beneficiary of the estate after Honey and Barry Sherman were murdered. So Barry Sherman had 2 wills when he died. And in the event that he was to die, Honey Sherman was the beneficiary of his estate. So she would have received annual payments from Barry Sherman's holdings, and at the time of his death, his holdings were worth $10 billion. But if Barry and Honey Sherman were both deceased, then their 4 children would split the estate of Barry Sherman. And a confidant of Honey Sherman did go to police and tell them that 3 weeks prior to their murders, Honey Sherman had confided in her that she had updated her will 3 weeks before she was murdered. Her will has never been located. So there is no proof that Honey Sherman had a will. And if she did, the Toronto Police Service has not disclosed that information, and no evidence has come forward suggesting that she had a will. But if Honey Sherman and Barry Sherman were both deceased, their children would split the $10 billion wealth. But there were conditions in the will such that if they died and the children were between the ages of 25 and 34, they would receive portions of the estate, but not the entire estate or their entire portion of the estate. And that would have been split in 4 ways. And at the time of their deaths, their 4 children, Lauren, who was 43 years old at the time, Jonathan, their only son, who was 35 years old at the time, and I'll come back to that, Alexandra, their daughter, 32 years old at the time, and Kaylin, their youngest daughter, 27 years old. So the only 2 children who would have received their full portion of the estate in 2017 would have been Lauren and Jonathan. And the 2 youngest daughters would have only received portions of Barry's estate. And when the police were first investigating this, they deemed the double homicide a murder-suicide, and so they had tunnel vision with regards to that and pursued every avenue that would collaborate their theory that it was indeed a murder-suicide in which Barry Sherman killed his wife and then took his own. But that was not the case. So the Toronto Police Service, when they first investigated this, because they had gone down that road, they weren't asking family members, such as the children, or close friends, about their alibi. And Investigations 101 is asking people where they were at the time of the crime or the murders, and that did not take place in this investigation. And by the time that it did take place, they had already spoken to a number of people of interest in this cold case that is in Toronto. Apparently, they did speak to the children, and a lot of this investigation, apparently the will is embedded in this investigation, and it is a very important part of solving this case. And since the 4 children of Honey and Barry Sherman are the beneficiaries of the will, it would only suggest that perhaps the beneficiaries or people who are close to the beneficiaries may be involved in this criminal investigation. And so none of the children were asked about their alibis when their parents were murdered. And I am coming up on 91 Old Forest Hill Road. And if I can get back to their children, Honey Sherman had fertility issues, and the only biological child was Lauren, their oldest daughter. Their son and 2 other daughters were all surrogate births. So they weren't Honey's biological children, but they were Barry Sherman's biological children. And at the time of Honey's death, she had a lot of issues, and her children had a lot of issues with her. They weren't very close. Apparently, her children were closer to Barry Sherman than they were to her. And Jonathan Sherman did speak to the police twice after they were murdered. And there is 91 Old Forest Hill Road. It has since been turned into 2 lots. And at the time that Honey Sherman had this property put in her name, it was a one big 20,000 square foot lot. And she was going to build a 16,000 square foot dream home on this lot with a revolving roof above a pool, 5 skylights. In the basement, they were going to have quarters for people who would help out in the mansion. They were going to have a monster playroom, and that's one of the reasons that Honey Sherman wanted to live in this upscale Forest Hill neighborhood, which Barry Sherman was actually opposed to because he was quite comfortable at 50 Old Colony Road. And I am going to go around the corner of this lot here. And they had lived at 50 Old Colony Road since the mid-1980s. And Barry Sherman was quite happy there. But he wanted Honey Sherman to be happy, so he agreed to purchasing this property here. But Jonathan Sherman did speak to the police, but more importantly, he did speak to the incredible Toronto Star reporter who's done an incredible job of investigating this case for years. And Kevin Donovan went out to Jonathan Sherman, the only son of Barry and Honey Sherman, and spoke with Jonathan Sherman. And Jonathan Sherman owns a 100-acre property north of the city of Toronto. And when he arrived, Jonathan Sherman stated that he didn't know why the reporter was fixated on the children's alibi or close friends and family alibi. And Jonathan Sherman did say to Kevin Donovan, and I quote, "I was a little confused about why you're so focused on timelines. Not like it matters, but like, isn't the assumption that whoever did this hired people?" And then Jonathan Sherman proceeded to show Kevin Donovan a picture that he had taken on the night his parents were murdered, December 13th, 2017. And they have these old signs that the city of Toronto has changed over the years. Those are really old signs there. Jonathan Sherman proceeded to show Kevin Donovan a photo on the night that his parents were murdered. And it was time-stamped for 7:17 p.m. on that Wednesday evening. And it was a picture of a seed code because he had a cryptocurrency account. And Kevin Donovan found it very odd that Jonathan Sherman had taken a picture. In a way, it's almost like creating an alibi. And another curious fact about this case is that Jonathan Sherman, his husband, Fred McCure, said that they were on a trip to Japan a few days before the murders, but he couldn't remember the exact day that they came back. He said it could have been the Wednesday or the Thursday. But Jonathan Sherman stated that that picture of the C code from his cryptocurrency account was taken at his estate on the Wednesday evening. So that's quite peculiar that Jonathan and his spouse have differing days for when they were back in or around 50 Old Colony Road when Jonathan's parents were murdered. And this property at 91 Old Forest Hill Road, and I'm going to walk a little south to give you an idea of this neighborhood. Back in 2019, I do believe, the children did put this property up for sale, and it ended up selling in 2020 for around $7.5 million, which was about $1 million less than the asking price. And Jonathan Sherman also sold Apotex, his father's baby, in a way, the pharmaceutical company, to a U.S. company for billions of dollars. And at the time of their murders, Jonathan's father did ask him to pay back close to $60 million. And Barry needed that money to pay off a fine he had received in a court case, because Barry was well known for fighting big pharmaceutical companies because he wanted to make generic drugs that would be more affordable to Canadians. And Jonathan Sherman was quite adamant that why would he kill his parents? For $60 million. And Jonathan Sherman owns a storage company, I think it's called Green Storage, with his husband. But Jonathan Sherman didn't pay that debt back to his father until he died. Barry Sherman died, and only then did he pay back the estate, the money that his father said he owed. But at that time, he had already gotten his fair share of the will, because Lauren and Jonathan, because of their age, 35 and 43, they got their share of the will. And a year after Barry and Honey Sherman were murdered, Alexandra, their second youngest daughter, had an interview with police, one in which she initiated. And in that interview, she pointed her finger right at Jonathan and told the Toronto Police Service that he was responsible or had something to do with their homicides. And in the interview with Kevin Donovan, Jonathan Sherman verified that his sister did tell the police that he was somehow involved in his parents' murder. And The children no longer speak to Jonathan, and there has been a lot of issues between the siblings since the death of their parents. But that is very curious that Jonathan's sister would say that he was involved in their murders. Jonathan Sherman has not spoken to reporters in the last few years. I think his last interview was with Kevin Donovan from the Toronto Star. The case is still being investigated. I do believe one detective is working on this case, and they are following every lead, but because they bungled the case initially, a lot of evidence was lost, and namely asking people where they were, even if they thought it was a murder-suicide. It's Crime 101, Police 101. Where were you when your parents died? And Jonathan and his husband seem to have differing views. So that's curious. That is very curious. And Jonathan Sherman was not only a beneficiary of the estate, but he was the only child who was also a trustee of his father and mother's estate. And a couple of people involved in the case who were close to Barry and Honey Sherman, who did a lot for the city of Toronto in terms of donating a lot of their wealth to charitable organizations in the city, said that if you want to find out who murdered the Shermans, just follow the money.